And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Stripe Dev Chats. My name is Cecil Phillip. And this week, we're going to be learning about something that I'm really curious about. I know something I've never played around with before, so I'm really interested in learning about some new stuff. We're going to be talking about Supergraph, right? Which sounds like an interesting way of stitching together a bunch of different GraphQL services. And I have my friend here, Michael Watson from Apollo GraphQL, who's going to talk to us about how it works and let us know what it is. So why don't we start off with a quick introduction? Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, who are you? What do you do? Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Awesome. Yeah, I just realized I muted myself. Thanks. Yeah, so Michael Watson. I lead the DevRel team at Apollo. So I've worked with Apollo Federation and GraphQL projects with various teams that have worked with Apollo over past 4 years now. And now I lead the developer advocates working towards building out the Supergraph and kind of helping that whole developer experience around that. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, glad we can have you. And I'm a big fan of the community, and I know you work with the community as well. So why don't we give a quick shout out to our community and all the folks that are here watching us live. I know a lot of you come in here every week, and I really appreciate you. Folks like Steve McCardle. I know Steve is here every week asking tons of great questions. And we have tons of other folks in here to join us as well. So I just want to give you all a moment. I want to say thank you. I want to let you know how much we appreciate you spending this hour with us as we talk tech. And today we're going to be talking about Apollo GraphQL and the Supergraph. But before we do that, as always, I want to switch over and I want to go through some highlights. So let's talk about a couple of these links really quick. Now, this one's not so much so Stripe related or Apollo related, but I thought this was really interesting because I saw this in on a podcast I was listening to the other day. And Douglas Crawford, if folks don't know who Douglas Crawford is, he's the father of JSON, right? Like not JSON the person, but like the thing we use for configuration and stuff like that. He's the father of JSON. And inside of this interview, he was asked an interesting question, right? And the question he was asked was, in your opinion, what expected changes in JavaScript are going to be the most important? And his answer was kind of interesting. His answer was, the best thing we can do today to JavaScript is retire it. And I was like, whoa, that's a big statement coming from this guy. So I'm kind of curious to hear what you folks think about that. Go ahead and let us know in the chat. Drop your comments in there. I don't know if you folks are JavaScript developers or maybe you do a little bit of Ruby, Python, .NET, Java, name your favorite language. But I thought this was really interesting comment from Douglas. I'll also make sure I drop the link to this interview inside of the chat so you all can take a look at it a little bit later. But yeah, I thought that was a little bit of a polarizing comment. So again, very super curious to hear what you all think about that. Next link I want to share with you folks. So in case you don't know, a lot of our advocates blog on the dev.to site, and we have a little section for Stripe on there. And CJ, one of my teammates, has this blog post talking about accepting recurrent payments with Stripe. And particularly is using a product called Stripe Billing. So if you folks don't know what Stripe Billing is, or if you're just interested in doing any type of subscription-based payment, like your gym membership or Netflix or whatever the case is, your Spotify account, like things that you recurringly get charged for every month, but you want to know how to implement that inside of your own application, take a look at this blog post. And I know he'll also have some more in there as well too. So there you go. And the last link that I want to share with you, a little bit of a personal plug.
All right.
But oh no, don't play it. That's not what I wanted to do. A couple of weeks ago, we had a Twitter space with a bunch of developer advocates. So we had Roselle Scarlett, Brian Clark, Jay Miller, and also James Q. Quick. And there's no video. This is all audio. But we had an interesting discussion about what are some of the struggles of developer advocates. And it was a really amazing discussion. One, not only because everyone in the panel had really interesting perspectives, but also we had a lot of folks from the community as well that were listening in, that came in with their own opinions and shared their thoughts about what some of their struggles were inside of their jobs and stuff like that. So if this is something that you're interested in, definitely take a look at it. It is on the Stripe Developers YouTube channel. Not the Stripe YouTube channel, but the Stripe Developers YouTube channel. So definitely make sure you check that out. And also, quick plug, We're going to be doing part 2. So we're going to be doing this again on August 25th. I think it's the 25th. But whenever as we do it, like we'll make sure we'll post on our social media accounts so you know when that happens. Okay. All right. So that's it for all the newsy stuff. So this is the part where I say this is no longer the Cecil show, and now this is Michael's show. And so now let's kind of dive into the Supergraph and learn a little bit about it. But I think I want to start. Why don't we start at the beginning, Michael? And I think for folks that may not know what Apollo is, could you give me like the super quick, 2-minute spiel? Like what is Apollo GraphQL? Like what is this about?
Yeah, totally. So, when I think of what is Apollo and what is Apollo GraphQL, I kind of go back to our roots. When most people think of Apollo, they think of Apollo Client, which was really one of the first open source client libraries when Facebook open sourced the GraphQL spec. So that's really the community that kind of started building what Apollo is today. And fast forward to now, Apollo's really helping building tooling and various open source libraries around developing GraphQL infrastructure, whether you're a consumer of the graph or a contributor to the graph with various data aspects. So it's an exciting time for our entire community. GraphQL has just been expanding everywhere. You've seen a lot of various aspects in the community have grown into other various businesses, and it's really flourishing. So it's exciting to see GraphQL as a whole kind of grow together and the experience around that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I feel like GraphQL as an API business has been way more like in my face versus like everything else, right? And I think about some of the other things that have come in the past. I think about like if you're a .NET person, we have like this OData thing that's been around for a little while, and even just like pragmatic RESTful practices, right? When we think about like the businesses that have come around those things and even the community adoption. But I feel like the community has been so much louder when it's come to GraphQL, but not just louder in terms of like their usage, but I see so many different products, so many companies, and so much tooling being developed around it. So I think it's a really interesting thing to obviously take a look at and learn about. And I believe you all also have learning resources too, right? Like, so if I wanted to, I could go to Odyssey, which I believe is one of your learning platforms, and I could learn about like GraphQL and like all this other cool stuff that you got, right?
Yeah, and actually you can get certified in GraphQL. We actually have levels of
I did not know this.
certification. Yeah. As GraphQL has matured, there's been more and more requests from the community of just further training resources. And we have a team actually dedicated the developer experience side of Apollo that is in charge of Odyssey and building courses of how to learn. It also actually includes, if you look at our YouTube, we've started to put more videos out of content of like how to build maybe pagination into your client application is one great video that recently came out. So there's going to be more and more stuff that we're going to be putting in there, and there's feedback. We would love to hear, what are some of the courses and things that you'd love to see that would help you maybe in your GraphQL projects and efforts.
Yeah, for sure. And for folks that are watching us live, if you're using GraphQL or GraphQL tooling, whatever language you're using, definitely love to know, like, how do you feel about it? Like, what are you using? Like, what are you using it for? Our feedback is always great, and maybe we'll do some more GraphQL stuff with Michael and the folks from Apollo if y'all are interested in doing that. So my next question for you, Michael. So there's GraphQL and then there's Apollo, right? And Apollo, from my understanding, is an open source implementation of a GraphQL server. But then y'all also have clients and all these other products that kind of wrap around it, right? And so as I was doing like my own little bit of research, I know you have things like there's federation, and then there's a router, and then there's this Supergraph thing. And so in my head, I'm like, are those all the same things? Are they different things? Are they interconnected? Do they?
Yeah.
Like how does that work? Like, could you unwrap that world for me a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And all of it's very interconnected, but I kind of split it into a couple different pieces. There's really going to be the open source side of what you need to build your GraphQL infrastructure. We have our client side libraries. There is the popular Apollo client, but there's also Apollo iOS, Apollo Kotlin, which allows you to develop Android, iOS applications with GraphQL.
Mhm.
So we kind of have the open source libraries of what you're going to be building to consume a GraphQL API.
Yeah.
We do also have Apollo Server, which is a spec compliant GraphQL server. It's been very popular in the community. We've gone through a couple different iterations, actually working on Apollo Server 4. That's another open source library, which is definitely a big part of the stack, building out one of your GraphQL servers. And then you start stepping into like, how do you bring all of this together? So Apollo Federation is really one of the first pieces I think of when we're bringing these pieces together. So whether you're a team that, maybe you just one developer, right? You're building out your project and you're starting to find your code base is a little too large. Maybe you're scaling, you're having some issues with, for example, viewing products versus a checkout mutation. They're going to have different scale needs. There's various things that you might run into, and Federation gives you a pathway of start being able to break this out into the modules of really what makes sense for you. And that's really just GraphQL servers. So we have Apollo Server, but within Apollo Federation, there's actually support for, I believe it's over 20 different GraphQL server implementations across like 10 plus languages now. So if you were building maybe a Ruby GraphQL server or a Python GraphQL server, that's just a GraphQL server in what is your supergraph, right? And the way we're composing our supergraph is with Apollo Federation. So supergraph is really more of this generalized term towards like what a company is starting to put together or what an individual, a team of an effort into a unified composition layer that has a modular architecture and has an agile approach of how you're bringing things together. In the past, when we would start bringing together multiple GraphQL APIs, we'd have some code that we're writing that's kind of bringing these things together. The way we see how the Supergraph works with Apollo Federation is actually using metadata within our schema to compose these different subgraphs together into one unified architecture, which is what your Supergraph is.
Okay, so then, like you said, so I can have these multiples of services, right? Like multiple instances of different GraphQL endpoints, each with their own schema, each having different responsibilities. And then I can federate to them, right? But then now I'd have to write like a little bit of stitching code. But then with the Supergraph, it's a little bit more automatic, right? The Supergraph would look at their schema, and then I wouldn't have to write that stitching code anymore. And it'll kind of just bring those worlds together for me, right?
Right, exactly. And there's also a lot of aspects when you start thinking of, okay, well, let's bring a couple APIs together. What does that actually mean? There's a lot of various controls, testing procedures, things we put in place in our GraphQL servers, our various data sources, throughout our whole stack. And when we start bringing these things together, how does all that work together? Where are the cross-cutting concerns, right? Are there places where maybe there's overlap, right? Like if you think about a very common scenario for a lot of projects, we start with a GraphQL server. It's really a BFF for our website. As that grows, our project becomes successful. We get the budget, the need, the requirements for a mobile application. So then the mobile team comes on, but the web BFF, there's some pieces they don't like. So they start up their own GraphQL server, another BFF, which uses a lot of that original server, but has the mobile flavor on it, right? And as this grows and propagates, where's the point where you want to start reusing parts of these graphs together? Start having representations of, what are the experiences maybe we should be providing in our graph versus, very specific pointed, API instances for our individual client application use cases, right? So tying all that together is a big question of like, how is that going to be done successfully? Because in that scenario, those two teams are going to have, for example, products in their graph, but maybe the mobile's product representation is slightly different. Or maybe there's some additional capabilities I can do around my product in my mobile app that I can't necessarily do in the website yet. And should that be an experience I want to have? Does that match with maybe the omni-channel strategy I'm trying to put together? And this is where you really need a strategy of how you're going to bring those together and what tools you're going to do to let those teams effectively have the flexibility they had, right? The mobile team started their BFF to have that flexibility, and they want to retain that. But you also want to make it where, like, hey, you don't want to have to connect to the product database and this stuff. You just want to use the product in the representation and the way you want to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So real quick, we got a question coming in from YouTube, and this one's from Bobby. Bobby says, we use Apollo server with JavaScript. All right, so shout out to you, Bobby. It's been a great experience overall. One of the questions I have, we plan to soon move towards TypeScript. Do you think it's better to use both at the same time? So I'm guessing when he says both, use both TypeScript. I'm guessing TypeScript and Apollo. I don't know if he means TypeScript and JavaScript or TypeScript and Apollo. I'm going to guess he means TypeScript and Apollo.
I'm going to guess that too, but it could be both. I have seen in migrations like a combination of TypeScript and JavaScript. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily. That's like a lot of work in there. But I definitely have seen it happen. I mean, in a lot of like TypeScript GraphQL implementations, if you're using .graphql files, you're co-locating your files in a specific location to make your distribution pipeline work out well. Or you're having, as a step in your build process, copying those .graphql files into another location. And I've seen some teams do stuff like that with JavaScript files in there successfully. I definitely recommend TypeScript with Apollo Server. And to plug a community project, GraphQL CodeGen is something I would strongly recommend if you are going to use TypeScript with Apollo Server. If you're using any strongly typed language, I would recommend you have some strategy to generate the types for your GraphQL server based off whatever your schema is. So one of the things that I've actually been working on is a strategy of templates for GraphQL servers. A starting point for developers to build like, a JavaScript server, a Ruby server, Rust server, whatever it may be. And in the TypeScript template that we have in that early work, it does include actually the GraphQL CodeGen library and all of that set up out of the box for you. So I would definitely check out CodeGen also in that migration to TypeScript.
Nice. All right. So I think we've been talking a lot. Why don't we take a look at your screen and maybe see some code examples about how this works and see how we can plug this stuff in together?
For sure. Let me pull
and then
up
while you're doing that, so for folks that are in the chat, again, if you have any questions about GraphQL, about the Supergraph, about Apollo, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll make sure that we get to them and we ask Michael while we're still here.
All right.
All right, and your screen is up.
Perfect. Fantastic. So one of the places I thought would be a good point to start out with would be actually our Supergraph demo. This is a demo that was put together by the team, and we can dig into this if we want. I have everything like up and running on my computer. But this is a great way if you want to try out the Supergraph and start playing around, testing out different things. I would clone this repo and try and run the make demo command. Should everything run up? This does use Docker. So Docker is one of the aspects in it. But what I think is a good thing to talk about is like, we talked a little bit about like what the Supergraph is conceptually, but architecturally, what is and what are all these pieces together? I have pulled up a diagram that gives a little bit of a picture into what this architecture is. Now, we had talked a little bit about how we have these GraphQL servers where we have, these subgraph servers here on the right side with various services and data sources behind that. All of that is being exposed through what we have and what we call is our router, our Apollo router. The Apollo router is actually built in Rust. It's kind of our high performance router to be able to understand what all the capabilities of each one of these subgraphs are. And the understanding of that comes from what we call the Supergraph schema. And this is really just a composition of all of your subgraph schemas. So, you have these GraphQL APIs that you're building. They're exposing these capabilities. All of that is composed together into one artifact that's used by this router to understand any incoming query and direct that traffic across the various subgraphs as needed.
So quick question for you then, Michael.
Yeah.
So just for me to clarify, so because we were talking about federation and the router just a little while ago, so would you say that the router implements GraphQL federation, and then now you have like the Supergraph schema that I'm consuming from my like other external clients? Is that kind of how we can think about it?
Yeah. So it's a little slightly different of that. The Supergraph schema has a lot of the magic. It has a lot of the understanding. So we talked about the metadata that you're going to put in your subgraph servers, right? The capabilities and things they can expose, those little data connection links. The Supergraph schema is the result of the composition, which means all that metadata, which is really the pointers at, this subgraph, if you give a product of this information, these key fields, I can give you these capabilities and understanding around it. So it really takes that as an entry point, and it converts it into a standard GraphQL schema that doesn't have that metadata for what client consumers see. So from someone who's just consuming your Supergraph, it's just like any other GraphQL API endpoint. No difference, nothing that's changed for them. But for the router now has access to this information of where some of these key pieces live. So for example, if you have some products, you have maybe some information like reviews that are coming from a different service, it can now take, for example, the IDs of those products and send that to your reviews service and get back the reviews information for those specific products. And that's from that understanding of that artifact, which is that Supergraph schema.
Got it. So then it's almost like, and let me know if I'm misusing this term, but it's almost like a reverse proxy, I'm guessing, right? Like, so, there's all these different services at the back end. I don't necessarily know where they are, where they live, but then I'm going to go through the router, and the router is going to expose to me the combination of that available schema, right? And then now I make a request, I post a message, and then now it's good. The router is going to route right to where it needs to go, and then that's it, right?
Yep, exactly. I mean, that's really what it is. When you think about the router, like what are the responsibilities of the router? It's to create a query plan. So one of the things with federation and part of this artifact is for any incoming query, a query plan is generated across that. So we can understand, how would this query execute across everything? I kind of think of it as like SQL's explain, right? Like it's going to explain to me what's going to happen. So it's going to build that artifact, that query plan, and then it's going to execute that and give the results back to the client. That's it. Very thin layer. And one of the things that I'd highlight in here, because we did go kind of from Federation 1 to Federation 2. We had a JavaScript Apollo a TypeScript Node Apollo gateway, where the performance definitely starts to hit a capacity point on the P95. And we move towards the Rust language and kind of developing the router in that direction, specifically around those performance reasons. And the idea of putting that like a reverse proxy in front of everything, it needs to be a very thin layer and needs to execute extremely fast. Nice. So the latency overhead here we're seeing is typically between 5 and 10 milliseconds in our initial benchmarks and everything. And we've been working on that with various early adopters kind of inside of the router and the feedback loop we have with our community.
Got it. Like I'm looking at this and I'm thinking this is a great example of how we could like aggregate microservices, right? So if folks are doing like Docker or Kubernetes things, or even if you're running your own processes on your own, data centers and VMs and things of that nature, then I can imagine, hey, maybe service A is an inventory service and service B is a customer service and so on and so forth, right? But instead of having to do service discovery for each of those things, I can have a single endpoint that kind of aggregates all of them. Kind of like you said, like it's a BFF, right? And now I just have to worry about one endpoint and making one request to a single place. And then the router will figure it out for me and send it wherever it needs to go.
Yep. And, one of the things that I think about in kind of that architecture and how everything is, you have so much flexibility to really think about, a lot of people thought about your GraphQL schema as kind of your contract between the client team and the server team, right? Like, this is the schema we're going to design. The client team's happy with, the query they're going to write. We use some mocking strategy so both teams can work independently and start moving on and such. But there's so much more and so much more we can get from inside of that. The reusing of these services, I kind of think about a lot of times the backend infrastructure has this very elegant design, lots of different services, lots of different strategies based on whatever the need of that application is.
Yeah.
But 5 years down the line, new technology comes out. Boom, you want to switch into this new thing. But if your clients are directly connecting to some API or directly connecting into this, your whole microservice strategy starts to become a little bit more technical debt each time. Where with GraphQL, one of the nice things is it gives you the ability to kind of have this abstraction layer where you can remove and plug things back in. For example, if you were on some legacy payments provider, right, and you really wanted to move on to Stripe, well, if you had your payments exposed as a GraphQL API, it would be really easy to create a Stripe subgraph that integrates with the Stripe's APIs or uses stripe.js inside of it for certain aspects of that whole process. And now you can have your own customized Supergraph that has the experiences and what you're trying to provide, but also leveraging the payment provider of your choice and kind of the world that you want to build your application around.
And I think having those abstractions are useful because now at the other side, it makes like the developer churn a little bit less, right? And also makes like the dependencies a little bit less, right? Because now I don't have to have hard dependencies on a payment provider or, I don't know, like a pub sub module or whatever, right? Like we can abstract some of those things using GraphQL and the Supergraph, and then just have the implementations in the backend, and we could pull those in and out, or we could scale them independently, right? And then again, like the front end is none the wiser.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll take a little step back from. I came from the .NET background, and I just think of all the nightmares of integrating with old .NET APIs. And
are you talking about WCF? Is that what you're gonna say?
Oh, yeah. So I mean, man, I even think of like .NET 4 and but there's so many legacy pieces of maybe a team, a business where they really want to leverage that inside of new applications, the mobile app, whatever this is. This strategy becomes very easy when you expose that legacy thing through GraphQL, because now those developers don't have to worry about what are those integration points or what is the SOAP connection strategy, to this. It's just, that's through my GraphQL API. The GraphQL API has that, SOAP integration or whatever that may be. And you got to do that once. But now that you've done that once, that experience can be provided to any of your client use cases and applications. So it gives you a strategy of how can I get out of this technical debt, in the sense of like, okay, I can use this legacy thing for now, and over time I can replace it with a new thing in the future. And that's one of the nice things about GraphQL just in general.
Yeah. That reminds me of a term we used to use, and you probably heard about this when you were at Microsoft. Like we also used to talk about lift and shift, right? How can I modernize existing applications, right? And a lot of that has to do with like putting like those layers of abstraction in front of them as we start to build things out. So now, we don't have those hard dependencies. I could move the server to the cloud, or I could move it to another host, right? And then as I continue to build out now, it gives me that flexibility of infrastructure while still maintaining like the functionality of my app, and again, reducing developer churn, which I think is cool.
Yeah. And I think we also are seeing, just in general, there's been an evolution in the industry over the last 5 years, especially around microservices. I think of a lot of the serverless frameworks and technologies where you have developers creating, functions or lambdas for so many different things. And the concept and the idea around, I build my monolith and maybe it gets too large and then I need to start breaking it down. I mean, that's definitely a story I see and hear all the time. But in today's day and age, I almost would challenge, like, why not start trying to build out GraphQL microservices from day one? Why not take
Yeah.
advantage of a lot of these scaling architectures? If you look at almost all the modern deployment solutions now, very few of them are defaulting to kind of the old Heroku, count how many instances you have,
Yeah.
right? A lot of it is much more about a usage-based type of situation. And this also gives you a lot of opportunities to do interesting things like various caching layers within the stack, right? You can do whole query caching for various parts or individual subgraphs with inside of this whole infrastructure backed by like a single Redis instance. And now when you're in this usage model, you could start having the actual megabyte footprint for each one of those instances be lower. Start dropping your costs
Yeah.
in areas that just wasn't really a possibility to the individual developer before, but
Yeah.
I could run SAM init on my computer pretty easy and just SAM deploy right from there and start a new,
Yeah.
AWS Lambda. So
Mhm.
um, I like leaning into kind of a couple of those architectures right from the get-go, as it gives me the flexibility now of like, I want to have this piece in this different world because I know it's going to scale differently. And there's a lot of parts in our graph. We already kind of know that. And, we could easily optimize our costs, our performance around that, and not
Yeah.
have to just have one option to scale. I think we can have multiple options.
Awesome. All right. So what about why don't we switch over and take a look at some code? Right. Because
Let's do it.
I love graphs and diagrams, but I also love code too. So let's take a look and see what like what the demo of this might look like.
Yes. So I have the demo running in the background, everything. There's a couple pieces of what we're going to talk about inside here. This is that Supergraph demo I referenced in the beginning, what we had popped up. And it's running kind of everything in the background. But inside of the subgraphs folder is really the GraphQL APIs that we're running locally inside of here. So we got 4 subgraphs in here: inventory, pandas, products, users. Pandas for fun because we wanted to add an extra one.
I was looking at that and I'm
Each,
like, where did the pandas come from?
yeah, right. Um, you know, there's always got to be some little Easter eggs in every project, I think.
I got you.
One thing at Apollo, we love having unique team names. So
Yeah.
all of the names at Apollo have, a certain theme to it, but we have some fun with it.
Does your advocacy team have an
So
animal? Like, how the Microsoft folks had like had Bit the raccoon, and GitHub folks have the Octocat. Like, do you all have an animal?
yeah. I'm pushing for that.
Yeah.
I don't know what animal I could say. I don't know. So I have this really cute shirt that some members on our team had designed out. That's got a cat on it with a space helmet. It's a castronaut. I
Nice.
love it. I think it's the
Yeah.
cutest thing ever. I want that to be it. But that's probably premature for me to say that is it.
The official one.
Definitely
I got
thinking
you.
about it a lot.
Well, folks, if you're watching still, go ahead and drop in the comments, or if you're watching this pre-recorded, go ahead and leave a comment in the video. Let us know what do you think Apollo's like animal should be. We'll take votes and we'll see what happens.
Ooh.
We'll take a poll.
I'd love to hear about that. That's a great idea. Cool. So we talked about those subgraphs and everything, right? So let's look at pandas, actually. I don't know why we would look at products. Pandas is going to be more fun. So this is just a simple subgraph built with Apollo Server. So Apollo Server is kind of part of our roots in our subgraph. So you'll see a lot of that. We are actually the maintainers of Federation JVM, which is the package you'd use if you wanted to do like, GraphQL Spring and like have a Java Spring Boot server, and then have that be a subgraph in your Supergraph. What I'd say is there's really just a Federation package for kind of every language GraphQL server there is out there now. And you're really just building your schema with that package. And that's how you kind of get into this ecosystem.
Okay.
And in the Apollo server world, there isn't a ton that we need to do. It looks like with our pandas, we have a pretty basic schema. But with something like a products where we might have multiple definitions of like how a product is represented, meaning, if you give me an ID field, I can give you whatever the rest of the product representation is. If you give me a SKU and a package, I can give you whatever the product is. That's kind of the way I think about this metadata that we're putting in here. But this is how we're actually adding that metadata to create connection points inside of our Supergraph. Now, I mentioned building that schema with whatever the library is. So right here, and this should be formatted better. There we go. The schema is being built with this method, build subgraph schema, which is a method that we make available through our @Apollo subgraph library. So this is the, if you were in JavaScript, TypeScript land, this is the library of what you'd be using to build that schema for your federated graph. And so we have the metadata that we're adding, we're building our schema with that. And now our GraphQL server is something that can be a connection point and used inside of our federated graph. But you don't have to add this metadata to have everything work in federation. One of the interesting things about the Panda subgraph is it isn't using anything about that federation library, but it's still in our graph. It's really once you want to start making these connection points. So what that federation library is doing is it's actually adding those directives into the schema. Because if you look, there's no directive defined for @key in this schema anywhere. That's being added by the federation library locally. So once you want to start making those connection points, it works. But I'll give an example. When I worked with the Expedia team, when they first started moving into federation, they had a schema stitch graph, had multiple teams all stitched together, but they didn't have connection points between those teams. So they kind of were like a flat stitch across all of it. And that's exactly what they did with federation. They federated all the graphs together without creating any connection points in the graph as a first step. And then they slowly started introducing those connection points as kind of like a step incrementation migration.
Okay.
So that's really when you want to add that package, is when you want to start making those connection points. But really, any spec compliant GraphQL endpoint can be a contributor inside of a federated graph.
Nice.
Now, that's kind of the subgraph side of things, right? But once you have the subgraph in there, like, how does everything get pulled together? We talked about that Supergraph artifact. So I already ran it. In the demo, there's a command. I'll make this one click bigger too. If you run make Supergraph, what it actually does is it runs this Rover Supergraph compose. So Rover is our CLI tool that is used to create that composed artifact. There's a couple other things inside, not a couple, there's a lot of other things inside there. But in this example of when we're thinking of like, how do we bring together those subgraphs into that Supergraph artifact? This Rover command is doing that. And we have this Supergraph YAML, which is really just a definition. Get out of here, Minikube. It's really just a definition of what are all the subgraphs that are included, right? We can understand what URL that lives at. Maybe we have a file. There's also different pointers of like maybe your schema, you're pointing at a URL. You can also have it point at Apollo Studio. If you're using Apollo Studio to kind of manage your Supergraph, that's one thing that you can also sub inside of here. But it's really just, explaining what are all the pieces, where do I need to go to get all the things to try and compose this together.
So it's like when I look at this, I think about, so again, I'm thinking with my microservice brain, right? when I see this, I'm thinking this is like file-based service discovery or like static service discovery, right? Like what are the services that are available in the graph? And I'm kind of wondering, like, so this is static, and I don't know, maybe you might be getting to this, but is there a dynamic way of dynamically adding and removing things to the Supergraph YAML?
So now I think we're getting a little bit into like, well, what's the full use case of what we want to go in there? Um, it's very common to have or want to have multiple representations of your graph for
Yeah.
various reasons. But the most common, and everyone has this use case, is you have a private graph and a public graph. Your private graph has things like your customer support application functionality, the admin functionality you need, where your public graph is really what does your website need? What does your mobile app need? What does your client public facing applications need? A lot of teams will build a directive. I've seen so many implementations where teams build a directive and they have a build step where they can essentially run their GraphQL server in two modes. One of the modes, it just has a visitor method that strips out that GraphQL directive or anything that has that GraphQL directive defined on it to give this private public type of flavor inside of there. And so like, as you start thinking about like this dynamic, like what do you really want? The question kind of comes in, are you trying to maybe version control your application with like a past API? And when that API changes, you want to force some changes in there. The question comes, if you have a client application that's consuming your graph, what if that change breaks their use case that's running? Right? If you have Android support, back when I worked at Microsoft, I was responsible for the Latin America region, and a lot of places I traveled, they had to support things like Android 3, which is only like 3% of the market share in the US, but in other countries, it's a larger stake. And a lot of companies will consider anything that has 5% or more market share in that overall distribution needs to be covered in their testing use cases, things like that. So one of the things a lot of teams will talk about is like, once you put something on a graph, get ready to support it for a while and have a deprecation strategy. I mean, that's why @deprecated was put in GraphQL, was to start a process around that. But with mobile clients, you definitely have times where if you have, some of those old clients, you're going to have to make decisions. Do you break, their functionality on the graph? And this is where you really need to have tools that help you understand how is your graph being used, what is it being used by those clients, and understanding when you're making a change, what is that impact to that change? So you can make a data-driven decision on that.
That makes a lot of sense. I also think another perspective that I was kind of thinking about initially was, because if you look at all of these, right, like there's hard-coded paths, right, with specific port numbers.
Mm-hmm.
What if I had multiple instances of an inventory service? Like what if inventory lived on, I don't know, 4,000, 4,001, 4,002. And so now I could round robin or load balance across them. Is that something you think that would be handled by the Supergraph? Or do you think it could be an architecture where like that endpoint is the load balanced endpoint, and now behind of it, I do have those multiple instances of my GraphQL implementations?
Yeah, I would think of it as the load balance endpoint across those multiple GraphQL implementations, primarily because you might want to have some caching strategies inside of there.
Sure.
So with the whole world of like edge caching, it's not crazy to run that Rust router in at the edge. That definitely is a direction of what we're trending. And when you think about running that at the edge, when it starts reaching out to these subgraphs, you could have CDN caching, for example, with GET requests for a lot of those things that are happening at the subgraph level. And when you start getting into these various caching ideas, a request to your router might have portion of it being cached from your CDN, portion of it going to, your servers in US West, US East, wherever that may be. And you might be utilizing something like @defer to be able to have that CDN information come back right away and have, the data that's going to, back home being deferred. So this is where you can really have options with, kind of as the GraphQL spec has evolved and those pieces in there of what you might want to slice in.
Yeah, that makes a lot
But
of sense.
that's why I would say the load balanced with the instances behind it, because then it makes that strategy of like what you want to do caching there a little easier.
Other question I wanted to kind of highlight or bring up a little bit. So I saw when you were actually showing like one of your JavaScript files, I saw that there's like open telemetry support, which is funny because I've been doing like over the past couple of weeks, I've been like diving into like open telemetry and trying to understand like, how to make traceable API or traceable SDKs. So I'm curious now. So is that like something that's built into the router, or is this like an additional package you just kind of had in there for the sake of the demo? Or, does Apollo and even the Supergraph like flow, like the trace context like back and forth?
Yeah, totally. So it's a great question. I'm pulling up our docs page on it right now, so we can get the URL here. But our router actually, by default, supports
Open
open
telemetry.
telemetry and giving the spans for that.
That's
I
awesome.
will find the actual link inside of this demo application in the README. I'll preview it so it's a little prettier. There is actually a section of the demo specifically around OpenTelemetry. So, we could actually try and run this right now. I did not have this running and ready, but
No, that's
let's.
fine. Well, I saw it and I was curious because you see, this is why we can't show developers code, because when we see stuff, we're like, oh, look at that.
I know, right?
Um,
I do want to give real quick a shout out to my colleague,
mhm.
Phil Prasic. Phil is the one who created this demo. He's also the product manager for Federation, the various pieces that touch in that. And he's done so much work on getting all these things in here because like the question of open telemetry comes up. He worked with various team members at Apollo and also in the community to make sure that's covered in here. So people have a sample that they could just run and be able to
Right.
understand how those pieces come together. But
Yeah.
our router does support that. Apollo server does support that. One thing I would say about it, some of the languages that have Apollo Federation libraries and support, that language actually doesn't have a library to support open telemetry.
Got it.
The
Okay.
box. Trying to remember, there's a couple, but like if you were using like Java, Federation JVM, you can actually flick a setting on there for that. Apollo server in the library we have there that supports open telemetry, so you can put that in there. It's a great way, and a lot of our enterprise customers and larger teams use open telemetry inside of their graphs. So definitely, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, because I was thinking it makes complete sense, right? Because we're talking about like the Supergraph, right? A collection of individual services, all like kind of bound together by like the schema and the router. Like I want to know like where my request is going, right? For whether it's auditing purposes or even like just debugging and performance and things of that nature. Just kind of being like, well, which way is this thing going? Like where's my request? And being able to see it like again in something like this, like Zipkin or Jaeger, or application insights if you're a Microsoft person, makes a lot of sense.
The problem here.
You can just do one. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. So this is from that demo right in here. So just ran those couple commands. I had it load test some stuff in here. So you can kind of go in here and see, what was going on. There's a lot of stuff, but now you can really understand like from the router into the products, back to the router, into the inventory, back to the router, into the users, fully understanding. And you can see how some of these are running in parallel. If you're using Apollo Studio, one of the things that we have is being able to preview the query plan. This also is in GraphQL Playground if you were viewing that.
Right.
But this is that artifact that the router is building from an incoming query, right? And you can see that it's going to understand, sometimes it's going to fetch across parallel. Sometimes that's going to happen in series. That's all going to be part of it. That's the thing I love about the OpenTelemetry aspect, is you can really start to understand from the execution standpoint, what's going on across those services. It really helps give a more complete picture to what that query plan of like, okay, it's going to execute like this, and now here's the individual details. So I can go look at, the products team if a certain aspect is, really slowing down the overall request.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And this is a beautiful
Cool.
visual too, right? So folks can see like that waterfall model of, where the request went, but not only where it went, but like how long did it take at each stage, which again, I think is really good for debugging.
Right. Now, I'd be remiss to exclude anything about Apollo Studio. A lot of stuff of what we've been showing and everything is really just, when I was talking about kind of the tools that are available for you to build with and everything. When I think of Apollo Studio, I think of like, how are we going to manage all these things together? Even with this Supergraph starting up, you kind of already called it out of, hey, this YAML file is kind of this static file. Like how does that work? With Apollo Studio, we have everything surrounds really our schema registry. So when you're talking about those individual subgraphs, inventory, products, users, pandas, each one of those subgraphs need to have a strategy of how they're going to like put their schema and updates to their schema into the supergraph. Also checking updates, things like that. Apollo Studio provides a schema registry, which becomes a centralized location for all the teams to be able to contribute into the supergraph. And so really what you're doing is you're having a CI job that's going to be pushing your schema or checking your schema into Apollo Studio to understand how that interacts with, your traffic, the other parts of your supergraph, and then also creating what that supergraph artifact is. So when some team makes an update, you want to be able to have that update be driven to, your live graph. You want to empower those teams to be able to contribute in the way they're used to. And so that rover CLI, there's a couple other commands inside of there around the subgraph, specifically the check and publish. So publish is like, I want to push my schema into the registry. This is how any team would be able to contribute into the graph. There is a check command, which we call schema validation. This has kind of been a long-standing thing with Apollo. It's being able to take incoming change and take a difference of whatever your current state of your graph is and do a static analysis of all your traffic to understand this change is going to break these elements or potentially impact these client applications.
Gotcha.
And so Apollo Studio is the managing, how are you going to build your graph from a procedural standpoint? What are the tools, the checks, the balances? What are you going to have all those in place for all those open architecture, open source tools that you're using?
Okay. So if I'm trying to paint like a big picture now, I'm thinking Apollo Studio and Apollo, the hosted service. Like you said, like I can create like an Apollo account and I can have Apollo Studio managing all my different schemas. I'm thinking about it like an API management thing, right? Like I have these different GraphQL endpoints, subgraphs registered, and I can create now a singular supergraph from that. But then I can also, if I wanted to, obviously run this locally, right? Because I think what I'm trying to do is like I'm trying to make the distinction between the stuff that runs in outer space and stuff that runs in my machine, right? So locally on my machine, I could run a supergraph if I wanted to. Like I could run it in Docker Compose or some local orchestrated situation, and have them running locally. But in terms of the management of them, now I push them to Apollo, and now I have Apollo Studio, and I'm guessing I have the built-in query editor and some of these other types of things that would now add value to me, kind of seeing what things look like from a production perspective.
Right, exactly. And, you kind of mentioned, really pulling together those APIs, there's definitely the whole understanding of everything, but also just the, as changes are happening, what is that whole process of like what's being checked, when something does fail, what's the reason of like why it failed, understanding those errors, here was a mismatch. So part of that composition of using the metadata in the schemas now gives you the capability to understand when some things are changed that maybe don't work across the graph. You now have tooling and ways to easily understand that. Of course, composition errors you get from when you run that rover command locally or anything like that. This is now starting to just bring everything more to a platform experience of how you're going to manage your graph and understand all those pieces together.
Nice. So Michael, I've learned a lot today, and I feel like we talked about so much stuff. But we are running low on time, and I feel like we're gonna have to have you or one of your teammates come back on again, because we need to continue this conversation. Before we stop streaming, is there do you have any calls to actions for folks, like things you want them to try out, links do you want them to go to? I know we spoke about Odyssey, but are there any other things that you think folks should pay attention to right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that demo is a really great place for you to start, along with, the Apollo docs are fantastic. The Odyssey courses are a great thing to go through. One other thing I'd say, if you're really wanting to get more into the GraphQL community, one of the big events that's coming up is GraphQL Summit. That should be in my URL saved, of course.
You did tell me about that. I remember.
Yeah. So this is coming in October, the first week. We're back to doing it in person and live. There's going to be all of these sessions streamed. Lots of stuff is going to be put up on YouTube. So there's going to be content experience for anyone involved. So highly recommend you check this out. Also, the videos at least will be great. There'll be a lot of great talks from the community. It's a great event every year, getting to see kind of just the whole community progress with new projects and things like that.
That's awesome. If I come to the conference, can I get GraphQL certified? Can I get like my official stamp of Cecil as a GraphQL developer? If I can?
Yeah, you can actually meet a lot of the educators there as well.
Awesome.
There definitely will be a lot of Apollo people traveling. Of course, with the current times and everything, travel is, of course, an optional thing for all the Apollo-nauts and kind of everyone there. So it's times change and everything, but
Sure.
there definitely will be a lot of Apollo people there, and a lot of people from the education team. Everyone's still figuring out the last details.
All right, great. Well, hey, Michael, this has been awesome, man. Thank you again so much for coming on. And like I said before, I think we have a lot more to talk about. And if folks that are still here, that are still watching, if you think there's more for us to talk about, if there's anything specific that you want us to kind of cover in the future, go ahead and leave us a comment in the chat or drop it in the description, not the description, in the comments in the video. And we could, maybe we could get something scheduled up for the future. But with that being said, thank you all so much. This has been another Stripe Dev Chats. Hopefully we'll see you all again in another couple of weeks. We'll have another amazing guest talking about some of the cool things that are happening in the developer community. Thank you all so much, and take care.
Thanks for having me.